Good evening, everyone. My name is Kalman Weiser, and I'm the director of York University's Koshitsky Center for Jewish Studies. It's my distinct pleasure to welcome tonight's speaker, Professor Asher Susser. His riveting talk about Israel's current war with Hamas about a year ago drew an exceptionally large audience and received tremendously positive feedback. Now, before we get to today's speaker and today's topic, I'd like to remind you that today is a historic date. The 8th of May, 1945, was the day when Nazi Germany surrendered unconditionally to the Allies. We're now 80 years since that day. Now, I don't need to tell you that the current war between Israel and Hamas and its consequences garner tremendous attention in the global media and on university campuses around the world. So much so that it went virtually unnoticed that in 2025, the population of Israel crossed the 9 million threshold, a number scarcely conceivable when the state was created in 1948. While roughly a quarter of Israelis do not consider themselves Jewish, the country is today home to more than 7 million Jews. This is the world's largest Jewish population, now exceeding that of North America, with its roughly 6 million Jews. Indeed, Israel is the only country in the world where Jews make up more than 2% of the overall population. I also don't need to tell you that Israel exists in a geopolitically volatile region. Indeed, a great deal has changed in the region since Professor Susser spoke to us last year. With that in mind, we are very happy to welcome him to offer his expert analysis of what he has termed Israel's place in the new regional disorder. Before Professor Susser speaks, I'd like to say a few words about his accomplishments, his very impressive accomplishments. Asher Susser is Professor Emeritus of Middle Eastern History at Tel Aviv University. He was the director of the Moshe Dayan Center for Middle Eastern Studies at that university for 12 years and taught for over 35 years in its Department of Middle Eastern History. He has been a Fulbright Fellow, as well as a visiting professor at Cornell University, the University of Chicago, Brandeis University, and the University of Arizona. He has recently completed a new book titled Jordan, Palestine, and the Politics of Collective Identity, a History. His earlier publications include The Emergence of the Modern Middle East, Israel, Jordan, and Palestine, the Two-State Imperative, Jordan, Case State of a Pivotal State, and a number of other titles that I won't get into because the list is too long. His online Coursera course on the emergence of the modern Middle East has been taken by over 120,000 students in more than 160 countries. Now, the way it's going to proceed is that you will have the opportunity to pose questions about Professor Susser's talk in the Q&A box, and after he speaks, we will get to those questions, and he will answer them at length. So without further ado, I'd like to give the floor to our guest, Professor Asher Susser.
Well, thank you very much. Good evening to you all. And special thanks to Professor Kalman Weiser for inviting me to this prestigious forum of York University. I will begin my talk on the regional disorder by trying to frame the regional strategic landscape by giving a snapshot of half a century of change in the Middle Eastern region, to place the current crisis and crises in a more deeper historical perspective. And I would say that the last half century of Middle Eastern history has been governed to a large degree by what I call the crisis of the Arabs. The Arab countries as a collective which has been fragmented, has lost much of its collective Arab decision-making, and a group of countries that a UN study some 20 years ago described as having three major deficits. The study that was focused on Arab human development, as it was called, spoke of the following three deficits that the Arab states generally suffer from. One is the lack of political democracy. The second was the deficit of first world education systems. And the third was the deficit in gender equality. And how have these three affected Arab societies, and why have they created this socioeconomic and political crisis? The lack of democracy and the lack of first world education systems has contributed to a certain difficulty of the Arab states to keep up with the globalized international economy. This difficulty has been reinforced by the lack of gender equality. People speak about gender equality very often as part of the political correct discourse. But what we're talking about in the Arab countries, and not only in the Arab countries, the lack of gender equality as a factor in economic stagnation. The fact that there is very low participation of women in the workforce, the fact that women tend to have lower levels of education than men, contribute to the fact that the productivity of Arab economies is much lower than it could have been had there been a greater involvement of women in the labor force. The result is not an economy that we can predict to be in crisis. It is in the crisis. These economies in the Arab countries suffer from a huge gap between population growth and economic performance. We have a situation where the Arab countries cannot sustain their population, and as Canada, one country of many in the West, is a target of Arab emigration from the Middle East, which cannot sustain its population. In the year 2000, there were some 280 million people in the Arab countries. Today, the number is nearly twice that, approaching 500 million. And as I said, societies that find great difficulty to sustain their populations, with the exception of the oil-wealthy economies of the Gulf that also have relatively small populations. Another factor that ought to be mentioned in this framing of the regional strategic landscape is the resilience of tradition. In the late 1950s, Daniel Lerner published a very famous book called The Passing of Traditional Society. That may have applied to many places and many parts of the international economy, but it did not occur in the Middle East. And the passing of traditional society is one that did not govern the development of the Middle East. And a new book published more recently by Michael Walzer, talking about the paradox of liberation, talks of the liberation movements in various countries in the Middle East, including in Israel, by the way, that have had great difficulty in producing secular leaderships to succeed the founding fathers. Religion and state are deeply interrelated in Middle Eastern countries. The Middle Eastern countries traditionally have been societies of groups rather than individuals. People belong to families, extended families, tribes, religious sects, rather than societies of individuals, societies of groups. And many of these groups were governed by their religious belief. Arab nationalism was a secularizing movement. Arab nationalism was based on the European idea that nationalism is a function of the language that people speak. Frenchmen are Frenchmen who speak the language of French, and Germans are German who speak the language of German, etc., etc. And Arab nationalism was to be this secularizing platform of Middle Eastern societies. But Arab nationalism never really papered over the religious and sectarian differences that continue to govern Arab societies. And many years ago, scholars spoke of the return of Islam after the failure of Arab nationalism. It wasn't really a return of Islam. Islam hadn't really ever departed But Islam certainly filled the void. Political Islam filled the void that Arab nationalism, in its political failure, left behind. A consequence has been the fragmentation and destabilization of key Arab states that have been split apart, in some cases broken down, along their sectarian dividing lines. Countries like Iraq, countries like Lebanon or Syria, Israel's immediate neighborhood. And this crisis of the Arab states, economic, social, political, has exposed the preeminence of the non-Arab states of the Middle East. The most important states of the Middle East today are not Egypt, Syria, or Iraq, but Turkey, Iran, and Israel, none of which is an Arab state. The preeminence of the non-Arab states, where Iran and Turkey, former empires, both of them, have had a much longer history of statehood and stateness than the relatively new Arab states for the most part. And this preeminence of the non-Arab states is also a preeminence of the sectarian divide between Sunni Muslims and Shiite Muslims. Turkey, the Sunni power, and Iran, the Shiite power. And when we talk about the new regional balance of power, this is the new regional balance of power between the non-Arab states. The Arab states have receded into the background in terms of their regional importance. It's all about Shiite Iran, Sunni Turkey, and Jewish Israel. The Arabs, mostly Sunni Muslims, are very much in the back seat. When the Assad regime in Syria was overthrown in December just a few months ago, the question that everybody was asking, well, where were Assad's Iranian and Russian allies to bail him out of his clash with the Syrian opposition? Nobody even asked about other Arab states. The question was, where were the Iranians and the Russians? The Arabs weren't even part of the equation. The war, therefore, should be seen in terms of what it has contributed to the changing balance of power between these non-Arab regional powers. And the key change is the retreat of Iranian strategic advantage. The war has dealt Iran an unexpected regional decline and defeat. Hezbollah, Iran's main proxy, the Shiite group in Lebanon, the powerful military terrorist organization of Hezbollah in Lebanon, was Iran's major proxy, severely defeated by Israel in the latter part of the war over Gaza. The fall of the Syrian regime, another of the Iranian allies, Assad in Syria, and lastly, the crushing of Hamas. So the Shiite crescent that people spoke about with Iran's expansion after the folly of the US invasion of Iraq way back in 2003, this Shiite crescent of Iran has been rolled back as a consequence of the evolution of the war between Israel and Hamas and Hezbollah. And Turkey and Israel, the other two non-Arab powers, are the two who are making gains at Iran's regional expense. And as Iran is weaker, the United States under Trump seeks, with a weaker Iran, to sign an agreement over the Iranian nuclear program in the hope that Iran's weakness will lead to a better agreement than the one that existed before, and that Trump canceled under the influence of Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel. But Iran is now much weaker. And its weakness was exposed very clearly just a few months ago in October of 2024 with the Israeli air attack on the Iranian air defenses, which are more or less non-existent in the present reality. And the question that now arises in the US negotiation with Iran is what is on the table? Is this about a grand bargain between the United States and Iran over regional influence? Or will this end with an attack on the Iranian nuclear facilities if an agreement is not achieved? That still remains to be seen. But at least a hint of what is in store was revealed just a few days ago, when it appears that the United States has come to an agreement with the Houthis in Yemen to cease attacking the Houthis if they cease attacking shipping in the Red Sea, with no mention of rocket attacks on Israel, missile attacks on Israel. I would say a surprising development for Israel, if not to say a shocking development for Israel, with this agreement between the United States and the Houthis in Yemen without any measure of Israeli consultation. Another facet of this new regional design is the increasing tension between the two regional powers that have gained at Iran's expense, Turkey and Israel. Turkey borders on Syria, on Syria's northern border. Israel borders on Syria, on Syria's southern border. Turkey and Israel, taking advantage of Syrian weakness and disarray, are seeking to increase their own influence in Syria, which is creating a battleground of tension and potential more than tension between Turkey and Israel. Turkey's extended regional reach into the Syrian vacuum, the regional expansion of Turkey at Iran's expense in Syria and even in Iraq as well, the undoing of the Iranian circle of fire that they had created around Israel through their proxies in Lebanon, Syria, and Gaza. And Israel's expansion, as a result of its gains in the war in Gaza and in Lebanon too, Israel's expansion into southern Syria to create buffer zones that will prevent the deployment of potentially hostile forces in Syria under this new regime that is not quite clear where it's headed, after Israel's shocking clash of the 7th of October 23, when hostile forces were allowed to collect and deploy on Israel's borders, surprising Israel with the attack of the 7th of October, Israel now seeks to create a series of buffer zones in the border states, Lebanon and Syria, in order to prevent a repetition of something like the 7th of October coming from other fronts against Israel. Israel has, as a result, taken also military action against Syrian military assets in order to prevent the Turks from using them, in order to prevent them from becoming part of a new, possibly powerful Syrian army. So this is all part of an Israeli strategy to penetrate into Syria, to prevent the deployment of potentially hostile forces there against Israel. And this has caused heightened tension and possibly potential friction between Israel and Turkey over Syria. Israel is concerned that the Turkish presence in Syria could constrain its freedom of action, particularly freedom in the air. Turkey may be assisting in the buildup of a large and powerful Syrian army, And the Turks, for their part, are concerned with Israeli connections with minorities in Syria, minority groups, particularly the Druze, but also the Kurds. As is well known, the Turks have long had a struggle with the Kurdish struggle for autonomy or independence in areas bordering on Turkey and even in Turkey itself. And therefore, the Turks are very concerned with Israel's influence amongst minorities in Syria that may prevent the creation of a stable Syria as the Syrians would like to see it, with considerable Turkish influence in Syria. Like in the past, the question that Israelis ask, is this about Turkish self-defense? Or is this part of a more aggressive design vis-a-vis Israel? The same questions that Israel would ask about Iran in earlier years. Is the Iranian regional posture one of aggressive design towards Israel or perhaps self-defense? Turkey, at least, is a member of NATO, probably less inclined to be hostile towards Israel than Iran. The Turks say publicly in these days that they are securing their southern border, stabilizing Syria, seeking stability and not confrontation, preventing Kurdish autonomy on their border and no further influence of Kurdish autonomy in Syria and Iraq on the Kurds in Turkey itself. Turkey is equally desirous of having millions of Syrian refugees who are presently in Turkey returning to Syria, maintaining their influence in Syria to prevent the regrouping of ISIS, defeated some years ago, in the southern Syrian desert. So there are good reasons for the Turks to be influential, to seek influence in Syria. There are equally good reasons for Israel to seek influence in Syria. And the problem here is they may clash in the process. There have been recent reports of talks between Israel and Turkey on deconfliction, and hopefully they will produce a regional understanding between Israel and Turkey over Syria rather than a confrontation. If we look at Israel's new-old neighborhood, or the old-new neighborhood, countries like Syria and Lebanon, Jordan and Egypt, what has changed and what is changing there? Syria has yet to establish the new regime after Assad. There is historically a sectarian conundrum in Syria. Syria is a mosaic of minorities. Kurds, Alawis, Druze, Christians, who all fear losing out to this new Islamist, and one should say Islamist with a radical background, regime that has come to power in Syria in recent months. And there have been, including in very recent days, violent clashes between forces of the new regime and the Alawis, and forces of the new regime and the Druze. And Israel has publicly expressed its willingness to support and to protect the Druze against attacks from the central government of Syria. So the new regime is not yet stabilized. The minorities in Syria remain very insecure. And Israel looks with great caution and suspicion at this sectarian conundrum and instability in Syria as Turkey increases its influence there too. The balance of power in Lebanon is changing quite dramatically. Hezbollah was severely defeated by Israel in the latter part of the war of 2024. Hezbollah has been weakened, meaning obviously also the weakening of the Shiite Muslim community in Lebanon, the most powerful community numerically, the most powerful politically, having a most impressive militia, Hezbollah, at its service. And Hezbollah has been greatly weakened in Lebanon as a result of the war, but it has not given up its struggle for hegemony. In Lebanon, the hegemony that it did enjoy until recently, but other forces in Lebanon, the Christians, the Sunni Muslims, are much more confident now to try and take on Hezbollah, reduce Hezbollah's influence, perhaps even achieve the disarming of Hezbollah now that the organization is much weaker, now that the organization doesn't have the Syrian bridge to Iran that it had before. The central government of Lebanon, dominated by the Maronite Christian president and the Sunni Muslim prime minister, in accordance with the sectarian confessional system, as they call it in Lebanon, is reasserting the power of central government at Hezbollah's expense. For example, in an effort to revive talks with Israel about disagreements that Lebanon has with its border with Israel, there are certain points along the border that Israel and Lebanon disagree upon. And the government of Lebanon is seeking to revive negotiations between the Lebanese government and the Israeli government over the border issue as a way of asserting the central authority of the Lebanese government vis-a-vis Hezbollah, in an effort to weaken the previous standing of influence and control that Hezbollah enjoyed in Lebanon. There is open talk these days by Lebanese commentators, often Christians, not surprisingly, who speak openly about normalization with Israel. Hezbollah's war with Israel is very unpopular in Lebanon. There is no great support for a war that most Lebanese feel is not their war. But Iran's desire to use Lebanon as a vehicle for its own regional expansion. So the talk, which is now far more obvious and open about disarming Hezbollah and weakening Hezbollah, is part of the Lebanese scene as an aftermath of the war, far more than it had been before so. Similarly, the Shiites, the natural allies of Shiite Iran, the Shiites in Iraq, are far weaker now as a result of the weakening of Iran. And there has been even talk amongst the Shiites of Iraq of dividing Iraq into separating between the Sunnis of Iraq and the Shiites of Iraq into separate states. There already is Kurdish autonomy in Iraq, and now they're speaking about Shiite autonomy, that is the breakup of the Iraqi state, further disintegration of the Arab state system. Now we come to Jordan and Egypt. Relatively homogeneous in terms of the composition of their population as opposed to the other countries we were talking about. Iraq is a mosaic of minorities, Sunnis, Shiites, Kurds. Syria is a mosaic of minorities. So is Lebanon, Christians and Muslims and Sunni Muslims and Shiite Muslims. Jordan and Egypt are homogeneous states. The great majority of Jordanians and Egyptians, well over 90% of the population in both cases, are Sunni Muslim Arabs. And as a result, they are more stable than the sectarian divided states. One may say, well, Jordan has Jordanians and Palestinians, and we all know that there's tension between Jordanians and Palestinians in Jordan. But Jordanianism and Palestinianism are genuine collective identities, but relatively new. They do not compare with the divisions between Sunnis and Shiites, Muslims and Christians that go back to the 7th century. Jordanians and Palestinians have their differences, and they are indeed serious. But the great majority of Jordanians and Palestinians are Sunni Muslims. And the social divides of marriage, for example, don't exist between the Sunni Muslims of Jordanians and Palestinians who marry each other all the time. So these are the two more relatively stable states, Egypt and Jordan, and I would say very much because of the fact that they are not these sectarian mosaics, but rather homogeneous societies of Sunni Muslims. The war in Gaza for Jordan and Egypt was a shocking, destabilizing event. The fear of mass movement of the Palestinian population. There was talk from the early stages of the war that Palestinians may be pushed out of Gaza into the Sinai Peninsula, which is Egyptian territory. The great fear in Jordan that as a result of the war in Gaza, Israel would take advantage of the situation to push Palestinians out of the West Bank into Jordan. Violence by settlers against Palestinians in the West Bank was seen as a forerunner to this idea of pushing the Palestinians out of the West Bank into Jordan. This is Jordan's nightmare scenario. The effort by Israel, so they believe, and there are segments of the Israeli right who indeed speak publicly of this idea, turning Jordan into the Palestinian state. Jordan is Palestine, so they argue. More than half of the Jordanians are of Palestinian origin. So the argument of this Israeli right is that Eretz Israel, Western Palestine, what was the British mandate for Palestine, should be part and parcel of Israel in its entirety, and the Palestinian state should be established in Jordan. Jordan is Palestine, and the Palestinians should be pushed out of West Bank into Jordan. For Jordan, this is a nightmare. The fear that this would be the end of the Jordanian state, the end of the Jordanian monarchy, the end of the Jordanian nation and self-determination. And Jordan's relations with Israel operate on two contradictory levels at one and the same time. On the one hand, as is very well known and spoken of very often, Israel and Jordan are regional allies. They cooperate in defense matters, they share intelligence. The Jordanians participated in the protection of Israeli airspace when Iran attacked Israel with missiles twice during the recent war. So in terms of regional strategy, Jordan and Israel have a lot in common. They have common interests in Syria, seek to prevent too much Turkish influence in Syria, to maintain stability in Syria rather than having an Islamist extremist government in control there. So there is much regional cooperation. But at one and the same time, the Jordanians fear that Israel is strategically hostile and that it harbors designs on the very existence of the Jordanian kingdom. So Jordan is a great believer in the two-state solution. In the eyes of the Jordanians, the two-state solution would secure a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza, so it would be clear that Palestine is in Palestine, and Jordan is Jordan. Jordan is not Palestine. Jordan is Jordan, and Palestine is Palestine. And the Jordanians, therefore, are very devoted strategically, perhaps more than any other single player, to the two-state solution. But Israel presently is more unwilling, perhaps, than ever to seriously consider the two-state idea after October 7th. Netanyahu has been very reluctant to engage in any discussion of what is to be in Gaza and in the West Bank when the war is over. There is much talk about normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia, and that the Saudis would expect Israel to make some gesture on the Palestinian issue in order to advance the idea of normalization. There are many in Israel who think, I think mistakenly, that the Saudis are not serious about the Palestinian issue, and all they need is some wording that will make some reference to Palestine to satisfy the normalization idea. I myself think that the Saudis are far more serious on the Palestinian question, not because they care very much about the Palestinians, but because the Saudis, like the Jordanians, think that the two-state solution is essential for the preservation of regional stability. It's not about their desire to achieve Palestinian rights, but it is their understanding of what regional stability means. And they would argue, after the 7th of October, as opposed to Israel, that the two-state idea is the guarantee for regional stability, rather than what most Israelis would say today. The idea of normalization with Saudi Arabia, much of which is spoken about in Israel and elsewhere, is not about, as far as the Saudis are concerned, creating an alliance of war against Iran. Israel sees the normalization with Saudi Arabia as a chapter, as a component of the struggle versus Iran. That's not the way the Saudis see it. The Saudis don't see it as a struggle against Iran. They see it mainly as an avenue to a defense treaty with the United States of America. For them, normalization with Israel is not to be used to fight Iran, but rather for the Saudis to obtain a defense treaty with the United States. Israel and Saudi Arabia may be speaking what sounds like the same language, but they have very different objectives in mind. And now we come to Israel. What has Israel gained from the war? Israel's war gains, first of all, the crushing of Hamas. But what exactly is the crushing of Hamas? It's not a question of manpower. Hamas can replace manpower lost in the war with Israel with relative ease, and it is already doing so. What is far more important and effective and lasting is the destruction of the Hamas weapons industry. The capacity to independently manufacture almost as many rockets as they wish in Gaza itself. This is no longer possible. And Israel has destroyed the industrial infrastructure of the weapons industry that Hamas did manage to create in Gaza. And it has much greater difficulty in reestablishing that than replenishing their manpower, which they can do, as I say, with relative ease. Secondly, of course, the decisive defeat of Hezbollah. In a rather brilliantly surprising military campaign, Israel was very successful in dealing Hezbollah a much heavier blow than anyone, I think, would have expected, including even in Israel itself. With Hezbollah far less capable than Israelis initially feared of causing huge damage in Israel itself, which Hezbollah failed to do in this present confrontation. There has been a great deal of criticism of Hamas coming from within Palestinian society, in the West Bank in particular, but elsewhere too, and Arab criticism of Hamas for bringing a horrific catastrophe on the Palestinian people by their rogue and irresponsible behavior, by launching a war that Hamas could never win. So Hamas has also lost in the eye of public opinion, of Palestinians across the board. at least in the Middle East itself, if not outside of the region. Criticism coming against Hamas from Palestinians and other Arabs for having engaged in reprehensible immoral behavior. The manner in which Hamas waged its war against Israel. Another gain for Israel, the fall of Assad. The fall of the Assad regime, again, unexpected, not a direct result of the war, but certainly through the regional opportunities created by the war. The encouragement by the Turks of the radical Sunni Muslim opposition in northern Syria to wage their attack against Assad. I don't think they believed that they were going to bring down the regime, but they surprised themselves and did. With the Iranians incapable of supporting the Assad regime, which, as we know, came to its dramatic end. This is all part of a greater gain, the overall Iranian geostrategic setback that we have already spoken about. There are the Houthis in Yemen, a rather strange phenomenon that is not entirely clear what it is that the Houthis in Yemen have to do with the conflict with Israel. Well, at least in their mind, and certainly in the mind of the public opinion in Yemen and in other parts of the Arab world, the conflict with the Palestinians is a conflict in which the Arabs certainly obviously identify with their Palestinian brethren. But this is also part of the internal Yemeni political conflict. Yemen is also divided between Shiites and Sunnis. Shiites of a different branch than the main branch that Iran represents, but Shiites all the same. And the Houthis are Shiites. And using the conflict with Israel is a way of shoring up their popular support in the struggle for dominance in Yemen. And that is the main objective and reason why the Houthis have this stake in the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians. But on the negative side, things have been difficult for Israel. It has achieved the gains I mentioned, but Israel is facing attrition on many different levels. If we compare Israel in terms of assets, territory, population versus Turkey and Iran, Israel has a territory of 22,000 square kilometers and close to 10 million people as its population. Iran and Turkey have 90 million people each. Turkey has nearly 1 million square kilometers to its territory, 900,000 square kilometers. And Iran is over 1.5 million square kilometers. These are huge countries in comparison to Israel. Huge countries with a huge territorial mass and very large populations. Israel is smaller and rather vulnerable in comparison. From the founding of the State of Israel, the military doctrine was based on the fact that Israel had small territory, small population, could not maintain a huge standing army, could not fight long wars because of the economic and human expense. Israel developed a military doctrine based on short wars, fought by a reserve army in the main in terms of its land forces. This is not what the war in Gaza turned out to be. Not the Six-Day War of 1967, not even the Yom Kippur War, which took 3 weeks. over a year and a half, and it isn't over yet. This is a war of enormous human and financial cost to Israel. Reservists, instead of serving for a few weeks a year, are serving hundreds of days a year, 200, 300 days. Very difficult to maintain a business, to study at university, to maintain a family. The pressure on the reservists is great, and there is a certain exhaustion of the reserve army, which numerically is the backbone of the Israeli Defense Forces. The casualties have been heavy. Over 15,000 Israelis have been seriously injured. Nearly 2,000 Israelis have been killed in the war. There is presently a lack of consensus on what the war in Gaza is all about. A disagreement over priorities. Is it the hostages first, or is it total defeat of Hamas? Are the two objectives that can both be achieved at the same time? It seems to be rather difficult. After 18 months and more, the total defeat of Hamas has not been attained. If the war is to be resumed at full force now, what will be done that has not been done until now? There is suspicion amongst many Israelis that the war has a lot to do with Netanyahu's domestic political objectives of maintaining his coalition, rather than the service of Israeli long-term strategic needs. There is a manpower crisis in Israel these days because of the exhaustion of the reserve forces. And this brings up another issue. The ultra-Orthodox and their military service. Why don't they serve? Why shouldn't they serve? Especially when those who do serve are being exhausted by the lack of manpower, which could be seriously addressed if the Orthodox were to serve under the laws of conscription just like everybody else. The crisis in Israel and the long duration of the war and its social and societal pressure has led to relatively large emigration from Israel. 90,000 Israelis have left since the 7th of October. This is not just 90,000 people leaving, but also a brain drain in many respects. More than 8,000 high-tech people are amongst those who have left the country. There are many professionals, doctors and academics talking about leaving. A lot of it has to do with the lack of confidence in the manner in which the Israeli government is managing the crisis. The declining performance of the Israeli education system. There is more governmental financial support for yeshivot than there is for higher education. There are many in Israel who would argue that that is a self-defeating, long-term kind of policy. The erosion of the quality and the quantity of Israel's human capital. This, of course, doesn't go unnoticed by Israel's Arab neighbors. Israel, one Arab source says, is caught in the eye of a social and political storm that has been brewing for years. There is a brain drain, stress on Israel's economic and academic centers of power. Israel, another source says, is nothing more than a dry leaf blowing in the wind, if only dependent on the United States. So Israel's domestic crisis is not unnoticed by the neighborhood. And against this background, the Trump plan for Gaza. The initiation of the plan, its subsequent demise, return and demise yet again. There are some dubious and critical reviews of Trump coming from Israeli commentators. Trump, one says, appears like a hurricane threatening to destroy everything in its path, only to vanish in a cloud of dust. Trump's policies, another says, are a collection of question and exclamation marks in random disorder. So where is Trump going with the Middle East, with Israel and the Palestinians, with the United States and the Houthis, with the United States and Iran? It's all very much up in the air. How is this seen from Jordan and Egypt? The Trump idea about the shifting of population, the creation of a Riviera in Gaza, with the removal, the expulsion, or the voluntary emigration, which Arabs interpret as expulsion, as seen from Jordan and Egypt. For both of them, it's a threat. For both of them, it could affect the peace treaties that they have with Israel. And both have said so. That an effort to push Palestinians into Jordan would lead to a reevaluation and perhaps even a cancellation of the peace treaty with Israel. And the Egyptians have said similar things about millions of Palestinians who may be Hamas sympathizers pushed into Gaza as potential supporters of the Muslim Brethren, which the Egyptian government is fighting with all its power to suppress. These, from their point of view, are causes for much fear and apprehension. And Jordan and Egypt flatly reject, needless to say, the undermining of what they see as the undermining of their national security interests. The Egyptians have proposed an alternative plan in order to defeat the Trump proposals, a plan that will keep the idea of the two-state option open, that will keep the people in Gaza, that will open an opportunity for the Palestinian Authority to take control of Gaza in preparation for the formation of a Palestinian state further down the line between the West Bank and Gaza under the Palestinian Authority. But these plans that the Egyptians have spoken of and have been supported by the Arab League are vague on critical issues. What is to happen to Hamas exactly? Is Hamas going to be disarmed? And if it is, how is that going to be brought about? More than $50 billion have been slated by the Egyptians as needed for the reconstruction of Gaza. Who's going to provide this $50 billion? It's all pretty much up in the air. Israel's aims in the war in Gaza at present seem to be rather unclear. Is it first about total victory and secondly the hostages, or the other way around? If the war is to continue, this will lead to further destruction of Gaza, a deepening of the humanitarian crisis, and a further extension of Israel's international isolation. These are all matters that are very much in the Israeli discourse, watched very attentively by Israel's Arab neighbors. But for the meantime, the great decisions about bringing this war to an end have not been made. So I will end my remarks there, and thank you very much for your attention. And the floor is now yours, and I will answer your questions as they may be. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Asher. That was a fantastic, tremendously informative and insightful analysis of the region. While the audience takes a few minutes to pose its questions, I have a couple of questions I'd like to ask you. My first question is, what would cancellation of peace treaties with Egypt and Jordan mean at a practical level for Israel, as well as for those countries?
Well, first of all, the end of diplomatic relations. Our embassies would disappear, as would theirs in Israel. But that's, let's say, in the formal sphere. It would be a much higher level of danger of a loss of control of the military situation in the Sinai Peninsula. If the peace treaty doesn't exist anymore, then the force limitations that are imposed on Egypt through the peace treaty won't be valid anymore. That could create a whole new ballgame between Israel and Egypt, extremely volatile and dangerous. Jordan, I don't think, would mean an aggressive design by the Jordanians versus Israel. But if there were to be an attempt by Israel to push Palestinians out of the West Bank into Jordan, Jordan would see that as an act of war, and they have said so openly. And they would fight to prevent that from happening. Now, these are the only two countries with whom we have peace treaties at all, with whom we have ever had peace treaties. So it's symbolic, but also way beyond the symbolic. And I would say it would create for Israel an extreme pressure for manpower, resources to govern the border with Egypt, to govern the border with Jordan, manpower resources that I think Israel would find great difficulty to find in this present situation. Talking about attrition, as I mentioned before, this would make it many times worse. If Israel would have to go back to the old days, where Southern Command, that is the front with Egypt, was the major source of Israel's military strength. How would we govern that together with the other fronts that we have to manage these days as well? Jordan is the quietest border. It takes from Israel the least manpower. That would all be overturned in a moment. So there is, it would be of huge consequence and to be avoided just about at any cost. And therefore, when the Trump proposals were made, there was a sense that there was absolutely no consideration for the effect this could have on the peace treaty. Because for both Jordan and Egypt, the idea that millions of Palestinians are going to be dumped into their territories is not only mind-boggling, but frightening from their point of view in terms of their domestic security and stability.
Okay. I see some questions have arrived while you were answering. Thank you. So I'm going to put off my other questions for the moment, and I'm going to turn to the audience's questions. So the first question is short. The others are a bit more involved. Not to say that your answer needs to be short, but it's fewer words. The first question is this. Is the current Israeli government interested in being an integrated element in the Middle East or in the long term?
To be an integrated element?
To be integrated into the larger fabric of the Middle East in the long term.
I don't think the current government has that desire in mind. I think there is a desire to have political relations with certain Arab states, like in Saudi Arabia, for example. But there is, I think, a fear of losing Israel's identity by integration into the region. And there will be, I would imagine, a continued Israeli desire to preserve the uniqueness of the Israeli state with relations of peace with Israel and the neighborhood. But that doesn't mean integration in the sense of Israel losing its independent character. Like, for example, a confederation or a federation with Palestine or Jordan or both of them.
Okay, thank you. The next question. It would seem that maintaining 6 million Palestinians under military rule with limited rights indefinitely should be unsustainable, not in Israel's long-term interests, nor in the interest of the long-term stability for the region. Do you think the majority of Israelis would agree with this? And do you think Netanyahu would personally agree if he were not on trial and subject to the influence of his right-wing coalition?
Well, first of all, I would say I don't think the majority of Israelis today would accept that analysis. Personally, I do. But I don't think the majority of Israelis would agree with that at present. I personally do believe, and in fact, you mentioned the book I wrote some years ago on what I called the two-state imperative, and I still believe in the two-state imperative precisely for those reasons. Israel cannot govern 6 million Palestinians without rights forever. It is not a sustainable situation. The problem is that people in Israel would argue that we've got other issues at hand, more immediate, such as the 7th of October. And can we allow a situation to emerge where the 7th of October could be repeated because of the manner in which we govern the 6 million Palestinians next door? So these are issues that are very difficult to settle in the Israeli body politic. As for Netanyahu, I think that ideologically he doesn't believe in the two-state idea, and he never did. And I don't think that he is completely at loggerheads with the two-state idea because of his right-wing coalition. He could have had a different coalition had he wished to have one. The right-wing coalition is Netanyahu's choice as the most stable coalition as far as he is concerned, because it does not broach the two-state idea. The whole idea of having Hamas in control of Gaza and the Palestinian Authority in control of the West Bank was to have a situation in which the Palestinians would not have a united leadership and Israel would not have to negotiate the creation of a Palestinian state. This was the foundation of Netanyahu's strategy, and I would think still is. So I personally, I do believe that the occupation and the control of 6 million Palestinians, as was mentioned, is not a sustainable reality. But I don't think the government of Israel thinks so. I don't think Netanyahu thinks so. And I don't think most Israelis think so today. Unfortunately, in my view.
The next question is about Egypt. Egypt apparently has 3 armies, one for the country as a whole, one for Cairo alone, and one for the Sinai, where they have built up a lot of tanks. How much
a lot
of tanks.
Uh-huh.
How much of a real threat is their army in Sinai now?
Well, first of all, what the Egyptians have done in Sinai has been done with the agreement of the Israeli authorities and the Israeli military. And the Israelis allowed the Egyptians to depart from certain segments of the agreement between Israel and Egypt in order for the Egyptians to be able to suppress Islamic extremism in the Sinai Peninsula, including a branch of ISIS that existed there, that was suppressed in part with Israeli security, Israeli intelligence sharing with Egypt. So that is not a major threat at present. Egypt, generally speaking, has a large army which could become a major threat, but it's not the army that is positioned in Sinai which is this major threat to Israel at present. A lot of this was made an issue in the Israeli domestic debate a few months ago through some fake news that was distributed by Qatar, which was in competition with Egypt in the negotiations with Israel. And Qatar was responsible for the dissemination of news about Egyptian expansion of its military forces in Sinai as a way of turning the Israelis off Egypt. But it transpired that this was quite false and was not corroborated by Israeli intelligence sources.
Okay, I'd like to encourage the audience, if you have any further questions, now is the time to submit them. I'd like to ask an additional question or two since we have a bit of time. As you mentioned, popular opinion in neighboring Arab countries has largely diminished for Hamas as a result of this war, which contrasts with much of the popular opinion in the West. You didn't go into that detail. But I'd like you to talk about that. To what extent did Hamas anticipate that there would be a swell of popular support in the West? And to what extent, and think they can make use of it? And to what extent was this, a pleasant boon for them?
Well, I think Hamas was pleasantly surprised by what they saw in the West. I don't think they built on that. What they did build on was the very extensive support that they did get in countries like Jordan in the initial phase of the war. But the war has turned sour for Palestinians closer to home. That doesn't apply, I would think, to those who are in the West, who have, I think, a totally different agenda and are motivated by a whole series of other questions that have to do with their own space in the Western academic atmosphere that they find themselves in, but not the Palestinians who live in the West Bank or in Israel, for example, or in Jordan. In Jordan, they were very popular. Hamas was very popular in the beginning, in the initial phase of the war, but as the war dragged on and Palestinian casualties rose higher and higher, the criticism and indeed the hatred for Israel did not diminish at all. But there was far greater questioning of the wisdom of Hamas's decision-making. That has become more profound. Interestingly enough, just a week or two ago, the Jordanian government crushed the Muslim Brethren in Jordan. I don't think they would have done that. Outlawing the Muslim Brethren in Jordan, taking such an extreme act against the Muslim Brethren in Jordan, if they still thought that Hamas was that popular in Jordan. And I think the government took advantage of the fact that Hamas is not as popular as it was in order to bring the heavy hammer down on Hamas's allies in Jordan.
Okay, thank you. The next question is this one. Are Israel war gains at risk if the conflict continues much longer?
I think they could be. I think they could be at risk. What Israel has not done, and I think very unfortunately, and a huge, I would say, strategic error, the war has never had, from the outset, a very clear-cut diplomatic, political objective. Once Hamas has been crushed, what is it that Israel would want to do with Gaza? Where do we go from here? What is the policy for what the Americans called the day after? Now, Israel have avoided the day after very determinedly, because the day after requires concessions of some kind or another to the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. If Hamas is to be replaced in Gaza, who is going to replace them? They aren't going to be replaced by anyone other than the Palestinian Authority. There is no other body who could possibly replace Hamas in Gaza. But the government is totally unwilling to do so. And they see the replacement of Hamas by the Palestinian Authority as replacing one illegitimate Palestinian Authority by another. The government makes no distinction between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority in terms of their relative legitimacy. And that leaves Israel with a military campaign which is grinding on and on with no clear-cut diplomatic political objective. Military campaigns are not fought for military campaigns, but to achieve military political objectives. What are they? They have never been clearly defined. And to say the crushing of Hamas and the return of the hostages is all very well, but how is that achieved exactly? And does the crushing of Hamas contribute to the return of the hostages or hasten their demise?
Very difficult situation. Another question has appeared. Following up on the sustainability of military rule, if a peace proposal that guaranteed Israel's security and was acceptable to the Palestinians were presented to the Israelis, do you think the majority of Israelis would reject it?
Well, what is the guarantee for Israeli security? How exactly is that defined? I think it would require a guarantee that would give Israel a great measure of say, if not to say control, of what actually happens in the defense sphere in the West Bank and Gaza. Israel cannot simply withdraw from the West Bank and Gaza and let it be. Israel is going to have some kind of say in the way in which these territories are governed in the future, even by a Palestinian Authority. If that were to be included in the agreement, I think that the Israelis could live with that. Okay, the problem is Israelis understand that there has to be some kind of compromise in the long term, but it's extremely difficult for the Israelis with the 7th of October in their minds as a traumatic event, the likes of which they've never experienced. For the great majority of them were all born after the Holocaust. It is extremely difficult for them to think in terms of the Palestinians as peaceful neighbors. And I think it's going to take a long time for that to mature. The problem that I have with that is that it's not enough to say that it's going to take a long time. We have to have a vision of the future and create a policy that serves the vision of the future, even if this vision will only be realistically implemented in 15 years' time. For example, I would say, if we do envision a situation where there will be some form of two-state reality, I'm not going to create another 100 settlements in the West Bank in the meantime. There are things that we should not be doing if we have a vision of the future. If we have a vision of the future, which is the end, the control forever of the West Bank and Gaza, then there are things that we will do. And some are seeking to do precisely that right now. Some on the Israeli right are trying to create a situation where Israel will actually conquer Gaza and remain there, which means pushing out the great majority of the population, and all that goes with that. There are people, important ministers like Bezalel Smotrich, for example, very well known, is a key figure in forwarding a policy of this design precisely. And what I find the shortcoming with the Israeli policy is not what it is that we do right now, but how do you create a long-term vision of what we ought to be doing, what we ought to have in the end game, and in the meantime, not to engage in activities that undermine the end game that you have in mind. But if you have no end game in mind, what is it that you abstain from doing? What is it that you decide to do positively? There's no way of knowing. There's no way of making these decisions, and therefore they are not made because there is no end game clearly defined in sight.
I want to ask you a final question for the night, which is a bit different. It's about the Druze in Syria. As you mentioned, Israel has become something of a champion of the Syrian Druze, affording protection and medical assistance. From a Druze perspective, both within Israel and within Syria, how is this viewed? I would imagine that a situation for the Druze in many ways?
It's a very interesting question because I don't think there is one answer to that. The Druze themselves are divided between two distinct ideas. There is one school of thought amongst the Druze in Israel and in Syria who think that Israeli public speaking on behalf of the Druze, that Israel is there, has their back, that Israel will defend them and protect them, is very important for the Druze preservation, is very important as a means of strengthening the Druze hands in negotiation with the central government of Syria. That's one view. The other view is the opposite, that everything that Israel says publicly in favor of the Druze will be held against them and used against them. So the Druze themselves are very deeply divided over this. And both these arguments make sense. And you hear both of them from the Druze in Israel and the Druze in Syria.
Asher, I don't think there are any more questions, and it's almost 9:20, or closer to 8:20, closer to 8:30. I'd like to thank you really from the bottom of my heart for sharing your wealth of knowledge with us. And I'd like to remind everybody that they can sign up for your Coursera course, which has been going on for a number of years and keeps growing in the number of students. It's really remarkable. And I'd also just like to remind our guests that for those who speak Yiddish, very different subject from today's conversation, our next event at the center will be Sunday, the 18th of May at 2 p.m., where Professor Jan Schwartz of Lund University in Sweden will be speaking in Yiddish about Yiddish as a state-recognized language receiving support in contemporary Sweden. So again, thank you, Asher, and we look forward to your next visit.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Yes, and be well to our audience. Have a good night.
Good night to you all. Thank you.